Hi guys. Now, if you watched last week's episodes, you saw me talk about Star Trek and why I love reading all of the hundreds of Star Trek novels. I've been reading them since elementary school and I still read them today. There's one other series that I've been reading just as long, and it's something that, again, is in the triple digits as far as the number of books and can be a little bit hard to get into. And that's kind of why I wanted to do those two back to back, because it's sort of the same problem if you haven't already begun reading them. How do you get into reading them? And it's, again, a very overwhelming series that doesn't necessarily have the perfect starting and ending point, sort of going through one through whatever. You really need to know a little bit more before you get started. That series is Dragonlance. Dragonlance was something that was created in the early 80s by Laura and Tracy Hickman, and later Margaret Weiss came in on writing the novels. It was supposedly created in the car on the way to a meeting with TSR by the husband and wife team of Laura and Tracy Hickman, and they were sort of tasked with creating another world, sort of like what Forgotten Realms would be, to set D&D campaigns in. Something that could be a set world that fans of Dungeons & Dragons could get into and have set rules and set campaigns, rather than having to start everything from scratch on their own. It was something that was supposed to be very set mythology that you could just delve into and bring your own flavor and flair to, but something that was more of a concrete starting point. And how Dragonlance the books got started was through all the playtesting of the Dragonlance campaigns and the creation of the world of Krynn and all of the sort of like pre-planning before they would go to market. They were playing Dungeons and Dragons campaigns, and those turned into the original stories for Dragonlance and sort of launched the idea of writing the books. And oddly enough, it really seems like over the years, the Dragonlance book series has actually been more successful than the World of Krynn has been as a campaign setting. It seems like the Forgotten Realms campaign setting really took off and really took over, but Krynn didn't really seem to catch on in the same way, but the novels did extremely well. And this is something that I was introduced to at a young age. I think in probably about third grade was when I first read Dragons of Autumn Twilight, thanks to Keith Parkinson and his son Zach. I think he was starting to read them around the same time. And these, right here, this is a set of the Chronicles Trilogy, the original 3 books, and this is a newer printing. My original ones are actually, typically I really try to take great care of books, and I'm really careful with the binding, and I just want to keep them forever. The only examples otherwise are my original copies, which I think my little brother might still have, of the Chronicles Trilogy. Those things were beat to hell. Like, there are pages falling out of them, and the spines are literally just nothing but white creases. And normally that would kind of make me a little upset, but with those, if a book is going to be subject to that fate, I want it to be the reasons why these were. They were read to death, not just by me, but handing them out to friends and borrowing them, and they were all over the place, and in my backpack, and riding a bike in my hands sometimes, just all over the place as a young kid. Those are something that they were worn down with love. They were overread in a way, and if a book's going to go out, that's a good way for it to go out. And I do like those covers better, by the way, and that highlights a problem with Dragonlance, and something that even more than Star Trek creates a huge issue. With a lot of these Star Trek books I talked about before, there's typically only one cover. If there's a reprint, it tends to be in like a collection of related volumes rather than a complete reprinting of an individual novel. So you'll recognize covers and things. With Dragonlance, they've been reprinted so many times, and there's so many books that even as a fan, sometimes it can be confusing if you're looking through like a used book sale and thinking, do I own this, or did I own this, or have I read this? And there's so many different, there's at least 3 or 4 different printings of just this original trilogy, and everything's like that. It makes it very difficult to get into, and I have a lot of like odd doubles of things where it's like, I didn't remember if I quite had that or not. Is this the 80s cover or the 2000s cover? But anyway, going back to how I got started reading the series, it was something where I had never quite read anything like it before. I kind of made a big jump as a kid from, I had issues reading when I was really young, like first and second grade. For some reason, I wasn't a big reader, and I went a huge jump over the course of less than 2 years. I kind of went from reading Goosebumps to reading Dragonlance, which is like, I'd say probably early high school level. They're not quite as advanced reading as a lot of other novels of its type, which is also kind of a good reason why they're a great starter series for fantasy. They are big, thick 300 to 400 page novels, most of them. Some go over 600, whatever. But the original trilogy is perfect because since it's based off of a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, it's a great, interesting story that really sets up a world, but doesn't have quite the depth and detail that the later novels would add to it. It's something that does have a very personal feel, something that feels, in a way, almost conversational. You can almost sense the people sitting around a table and taking on the roles of their characters as you're reading them, and they're a fairly easy read. Not to its detriment at all. It's a fairly easy read as in an enjoyable read, not something that's overly simplistic, something that just isn't quite as complicated and thought-provoking as a much deeper read. It's not like reading Lord of the Rings. It is something that's more of just for your enjoyment and an introduction into the world of Krynn and its mythologies. It's something where in these 3 original volumes, they mention a lot of legends, they mention a lot of places, they mention there's just it's sort of a great big setup for lots of possible stories, and the series from then kind of starts off in that. You hear about the legend of Huma. Well, Huma gets his own books, and you hear about like all these different people from their past and how this team that is now re-meeting in the first novel here, their whole past together, and you learn some big deep history and a whole series of adventures that they went on before the setting of these first 3 books, and those get novels and there are sequels, and it just pretty much everything starts from here. This is where you want to start the series, the Chronicles Trilogy, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, Dragons of Winter Night, and Dragons of Spring Dawning. It's these 3 here. That's how you want to start the series, because not only were they the first novels, but again, they are sort of the keystone of the whole series, or things that take place all around it, geographically and as far as time. You go way, way back into the history of Krynn, way into the future, but it all kind of starts here and then spreads like a giant web. So that's where you really need to start reading. And for me, they're some of my favorite books of all time just because of the memories attached to them. There's something where I fell in love with those characters, and they were some of the first real big open world fantasy characters that I fell in love with, and they got me reading more in the genre. They got me into reading things like Terry Goodkind and Terry Brooks, and getting into the Wheel of Time, getting into those bigger, deeper, slightly more mature fantasy novels. Would not have happened in the same way if it wasn't for these books. There's something where even if you're an older reader, they're just a great classic fantasy. That's really the biggest point here, is that there's something that has aged very well, and there's something that's just a great, simple, easy read that's a lot of fun, that has something that you could say are a bit of like tropes, but in the same way, there's sort of just, classic ideas that are brought across in a very creative and fun way. And from there, the series spreads into a little bit of I'm not quite darker, but a little more adult-oriented, higher reading area. And that starts with the Legends trilogy, which focuses on 2 of the main characters from the original trilogy. That's Time of the Twins. This is a newer cover there for Time of the Twins. War of the Twins, and Test of the Twins, and a couple of different versions here. This is an older cover, and this is the one I started with in the 90s. And while these focus on these 2 characters going into the past and really discovering themselves, and really gives you something beyond these sort of cursory character exploration in the first 3 novels. The first 3 books really are something that gets you interested in these characters, but doesn't really answer the deeper questions that you might have, especially as an adult reader. And that's why the series is such just a great series as a whole, not necessarily in its individual parts, because any question that you have, any idea that you wish would be explored eventually is, whether it's by the original authors or whether it's by the myriad of various other authors that have come in and written maybe a trilogy or duology or worked on one series, or there's a bunch of people who did just one book in the series. And it's sort of one of those things where if you start with these 6 here, the original Chronicles Trilogy, and the 3, Time of the Twins, Test of the Twins, War of the Twins, read those 6 and get into things like Dragons of Summer Flame, the direct sequels to that follow the adventures of these main characters. And from that point on, you have such a foundation where you can choose where you want to explore. If you want to find out more of what happens to the future generations of these characters, their children, and them in their old age, and what happens to World of Crane after this, go that way. If you're more interested in their direct past, go back and read like the meeting of the sextet and things like directly involved in the past of these characters. Or if you are more involved, more interested in the history of the world as a whole, you can go back and read a lot of the stories that describe historical events or things in the way past. Or if you can take even another route and say you enjoyed the characters and the world and the history, but you're more interested in all of these interesting legends that are mentioned throughout a lot of the books, go and find the books that describe the story behind a lot of those ancient myths and legends. You can kind of go in any direction. So it's a wonderful series. It has such a great starting point, and it's kind of good for anyone because no matter what your interest is, you can go in any direction. Like I said, it's something that has just this perfect, easy read, just fun, light fantasy that draws you into a world without sort of the barrier sometimes of those very long, slow, dry volumes that many fantasy novels of this type have that can turn off a lot of fans. Some people don't want to sit down and read an 800-900 page book that sometimes has a 4-page description of like a dress and 20-page long political discussions, and not everyone likes that, and eventually it might be something where you could get into that, but it's not a good place to start. And Dragonlance, for me, I feel like, especially for a young kid or someone who's not a huge fantasy reader as an adult, should really start with Dragonlance. It's a perfect kind of starting point to get you into that type of novel, that type of reading, and go from there. Dragonlance is a great series that I have spent years and years reading. It's something that really got me started as a big reader. It's something that helped me learn to read in a lot of ways. Like I said, I jumped in a very short period of time from being slightly below my grade level as a reader in elementary school to being well above my reading level and towards the end of elementary school. Just this huge jump in a couple of years, largely because of my interest in a series like this, getting me more interested in more adult level content. So a wonderful series that you should definitely check out.